Imagine the First World War not as a sequence of battles or dates, but as a long, quiet stretch of time measured instead by hunger, routine, and the simple question of what would be eaten next. For millions of soldiers, the war was not only fought with rifles and artillery, but also with tin cups, hard bread, and whatever could be swallowed between moments of fear and waiting. Food became a constant presence, sometimes comforting, sometimes disappointing, often barely enough, yet always central to daily life. To understand what soldiers ate during the First World War is to step into the ordinary hours of the war, the slow hours, the ones that rarely appear in textbooks. In the early months of the conflict, many soldiers marched off with romantic ideas still lingering in their minds, and the food they received at first sometimes matched those expectations. Fresh bread, warm soups, meat cooked in field kitchens, even coffee served in proper mugs. In 1914, armies were still relying on pre-war planning, assuming campaigns would be short and supply lines stable. Soldiers carried rations meant to last days, not years. In those early weeks, meals were still recognizable, still close to civilian life, and still connected to the idea of normality. But war has a way of stretching time. As trenches formed and fronts stabilized, food slowly transformed from something prepared to something endured. The daily rhythm of eating became fixed, repetitive, and deeply tied to survival rather than pleasure. Soldiers learned quickly that meals were not guaranteed, that taste mattered less than calories, and that even the simplest food could become precious. In the trenches of the Western Front, the most common meal was not a grand dish, but a routine. Bread formed the foundation of nearly every ration. Often dark, heavy, and dense, it was baked far from the front lines and transported over muddy roads and damaged railways. By the time it reached the trenches, it was frequently stale, sometimes moldy, and occasionally frozen solid in winter. Yet bread was life. Soldiers scraped off mold, soaked it in water or soup, or toasted it over candles and small fires when possible. Alongside bread came preserved meat. Fresh meat was rare near the front, especially after the early stages of the war. Instead, soldiers relied on salted beef, canned pork, or preserved stews sealed in metal tins. British soldiers became familiar with a product known unofficially as bully beef, a corned beef packed tightly into rectangular cans. It could be eaten cold, sliced with a bayonet, or warmed slightly if fuel allowed. The taste was monotonous, the texture greasy, but it provided protein and energy, which mattered more than enjoyment.
Soup was another staple, though its quality varied wildly. Sometimes it was thick with vegetables and bits of meat, other times little more than warm water flavored faintly by bones or grains. Field kitchens worked constantly behind the lines, preparing large vats of soup that were then carried forward in insulated containers. By the time the soup reached the trenches, it might be lukewarm, spilled, or contaminated with mud. Still, soldiers lined up with mess tins, waiting patiently for their portion, because warm liquid meant comfort, and comfort was rare. Coffee and tea played an enormous role in daily life. For many soldiers, especially those from Britain, France, and Germany, hot drinks were more than nourishment. They were rituals. Tea breaks, when possible, offered moments of calm and familiarity. Coffee, often made from substitutes rather than real beans, was distributed especially in the mornings. Sugar, when available, was treasured, sometimes saved for later or traded with others. A sweetened drink could lift spirits in ways that no speech ever could.
As the war dragged on, shortages became unavoidable. Blockades, disrupted agriculture, and the sheer scale of the conflict placed enormous strain on food supplies. Rations were gradually reduced, ingredients substituted, and quality sacrificed. Soldiers noticed these changes not through official announcements, but through their plates. Bread became darker as more fillers were added. Meat portions shrank. Butter disappeared, replaced by margarine or nothing at all. In the German army, food shortages became particularly severe as the Allied blockade tightened. Soldiers received bread made from mixtures of rye, potato flour, and other substitutes. Meat became scarce, and meals relied increasingly on vegetables, legumes, and ersatz products designed to imitate familiar foods. Coffee was replaced with roasted grain beverages. Despite these hardships, German field kitchens continued to operate, and meals were still prepared communally, reinforcing a sense of shared endurance. French soldiers, fighting largely on their own soil, often had slightly better access to local food, at least early in the war. Villages near the front sometimes provided vegetables, wine, or fresh bread. The French army placed great importance on hot meals and wine rations, believing them essential to morale. Even as supplies tightened, efforts were made to deliver soup and bread regularly. Wine, diluted or otherwise, became part of daily rations for many French soldiers, offering both calories and psychological relief. On the Eastern Front, conditions differed greatly. The vast distances, poor infrastructure, and shifting front lines made consistent food supply extremely difficult. Russian soldiers often suffered from severe shortages. Bread might arrive irregularly, meat rarely, and warm meals not at all. Soldiers foraged when possible, relying on local populations, fields, and forests. Hunger was a constant companion, and malnutrition weakened armies long before battles did.
Across all fronts, one common experience united soldiers: waiting. Waiting for food, waiting while food cooled, waiting while supplies were delayed. Meals rarely arrived on time, and eating often meant rushing, crouching in mud, or balancing a tin on one's knees under threat of shell fire. There were no tables, no chairs, only the ground, a crate, or a trench wall. Cooking at the front was limited and dangerous. Fires attracted attention, and fuel was scarce. Soldiers sometimes improvised small stoves from empty cans, using scraps of wood or solid fuel tablets. When cooking was possible, creativity emerged. Bread was fried in fat, canned meat mixed with biscuits, soup thickened with whatever could be found. These small acts of cooking allowed soldiers to reclaim a sense of control in an environment defined by chaos.
Biscuits were another constant. Hard, dry, and long-lasting, they were designed to survive transport rather than please the palate. Soldiers joked that these biscuits were older than the war itself. Teeth broke on them, jokes were made about using them as building materials, and yet they were eaten day after day. Some soldiers softened them in tea or soup. Others smashed them with rifle butts before chewing. Chocolate and sweets appeared occasionally, usually as part of care packages from home. These moments stood out sharply against the dull routine of rations. A piece of chocolate could be saved for days, shared among friends, or eaten slowly to prolong the taste. Letters from home often mentioned food, described meals missed, or promised treats to come. Food connected soldiers to the lives they had left behind. Religion and culture also shaped eating habits. Soldiers observed dietary traditions when possible, though war often forced compromise. Jewish soldiers struggled to keep kosher. Muslim soldiers in colonial units navigated fasting and unfamiliar foods. These challenges added another layer to the already complex relationship between food and identity during the war.
In colonial troops serving European powers, food became a symbol of distance from home. Soldiers from Africa, India, and Asia were often fed unfamiliar rations, sometimes poorly suited to their bodies and traditions. Rice was replaced with bread, spices absent, familiar ingredients unavailable. This dietary displacement contributed to illness, dissatisfaction, and homesickness. Illness itself was closely tied to food. Poor nutrition weakened immune systems, making soldiers more vulnerable to disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses spread rapidly in conditions where clean water and fresh food were scarce. Medical officers recognized the importance of nutrition, but resources limited what could be done. As winters passed, food became even more important. Cold increased caloric needs, but supplies often failed to meet them. Frozen bread had to be thawed, soup froze before it could be eaten. Soldiers dreamed of warm kitchens, of meals eaten indoors, of the simple act of sitting at a table.
Despite everything, humor survived. Soldiers joked about their rations, gave nicknames to dishes, wrote songs about bad food. Complaining about meals became a shared language, a safe topic in a world where other complaints were dangerous or futile. To laugh at food was to assert humanity. By the final years of the war, food had become a strategic weapon. Starvation weakened civilian populations, morale collapsed, and armies struggled to feed themselves. Soldiers noticed that their meals reflected the state of the war more clearly than any newspaper. When rations improved, hope flickered. When they worsened, despair followed. When the war finally ended, many soldiers carried lasting memories of hunger. Food remained emotionally charged long after peace returned. Some hoarded bread, others avoided certain tastes forever. The memory of eating under fire, of swallowing cold soup in the dark, stayed with them more vividly than medals or speeches.
To think about what soldiers ate in the First World War is to move away from explosions and toward endurance. It is to sit quietly in a trench, holding a dented tin, listening to distant guns while chewing slowly. It is to understand that history is not only made in moments of action, but also in moments of waiting, eating, and surviving. As the war settled into its long, unmoving shape, food ceased to be something soldiers expected and became something they negotiated with reality. Eating was no longer a daily certainty, but a variable, shaped by weather, shelling, transport, and luck. A meal might arrive late, incomplete, or not at all. And this uncertainty quietly reshaped how soldiers thought about nourishment. Hunger was not always dramatic. Often it was a dull presence, a background hum that never fully disappeared, a steady reminder that the body was part of the war too.
In many units, soldiers began to measure time not by hours or days, but by rations. The arrival of food marked the passage of the day more clearly than sunrise or sunset. Morning was defined by thin drinks and dry bread. Midday might bring a ladle of something warm if the supply lines held. Evening often meant whatever remained, eaten slowly in the half-light of dugouts or trenches. The sameness of these meals blurred days together until weeks felt indistinguishable. What soldiers ate depended greatly on where they were stationed. Those far behind the lines sometimes encountered kitchens that resembled civilian life, with larger stoves, better storage, and even basic seasoning. Those at the front lived differently. There, food arrived damaged by the journey. Containers leaked, bread absorbed dampness, meat spoiled faster. Everything tasted faintly of smoke, earth, or metal, as if the environment itself had become an ingredient.
The physical act of eating was rarely comfortable. Soldiers often ate standing, crouching, or lying down. Utensils were minimal. Fingers became tools. Tin lids became plates. Knives designed for combat were used to cut food. Dirt was unavoidable. Mud found its way into every meal, not always visible, but always present. Over time, soldiers stopped noticing. Smell played an important role in memory. The odor of food, even bad food, cut through the trench atmosphere of damp soil, sweat, and decay. A cooking pot heating somewhere behind the lines could lift spirits before a single bite was taken. Conversely, the smell of spoiled rations could turn hunger into nausea. Soldiers learned to eat quickly before the senses could object. On long marches, food took on another form entirely. Rations were packed for durability, not pleasure. Dry items dominated. Weight mattered. Soldiers carried what they could, knowing that everything extra slowed them down. Eating while moving meant biting into bread without stopping, chewing while walking, swallowing dust with every mouthful. Water was often limited, making dry food harder to eat and easier to resent.
In moments of rest, soldiers sometimes became inventive. When supplies allowed, they combined rations in new ways. A biscuit crushed and mixed into soup became a thicker meal. Fat saved from meat was spread on bread. Leftover ingredients were pooled among small groups. These improvised meals were rarely impressive, but they were personal. Creating something, however small, restored a sense of agency. Food also became currency. Soldiers traded items constantly: tobacco for sugar, bread for meat, coffee for chocolate. These exchanges created informal economies within units. A soldier who did not smoke could accumulate cigarettes and exchange them later for something more appealing. Care packages from home elevated one's status temporarily, turning private gifts into shared moments. Letters from home frequently described meals in detail. Families wrote about harvests, celebrations, and familiar dishes, sometimes without realizing how painful these descriptions could be. Yet soldiers often asked for such details anyway. Reading about food became a substitute for eating it. Imagination filled the gap when reality could not.
Seasonal changes altered diets in subtle ways. In summer, food spoiled faster, flies gathered, water became more important than solid meals. In winter, caloric needs increased just as supplies became harder to deliver. Frozen ground slowed transport. Fuel shortages limited cooking. Soldiers learned to eat cold food without complaint because complaining wasted energy. Alcohol appeared in various forms. Wine, rum, or spirits were distributed at times, often officially, sometimes unofficially. These drinks provided warmth, courage, or simply escape. They were not meals, but they were consumed with the same urgency. Alcohol blurred hunger temporarily, creating the illusion of fullness even when the body needed real nourishment. On quiet days, some soldiers fished, hunted, or gathered food nearby. A rabbit caught, a fish pulled from a stream, a handful of wild plants added variety. These moments were rare and risky, but memorable. Preparing food from nature felt ancient, grounding, and strangely peaceful amid destruction. For prisoners of war, food took on an even harsher meaning. Rations were minimal, monotonous, and often inadequate. Hunger dominated thoughts. Meals were awaited with desperation. Food dreams were common. Survivors later recalled that hunger, more than fear, shaped their captivity. In training camps, food was more structured but still limited. Recruits learned early that military eating followed its own logic. Speed mattered. Wasting time was discouraged. Meals were consumed quickly, often under supervision. The habit of eating fast stayed with soldiers long after the war. Cultural misunderstandings around food sometimes caused tension. Soldiers from different regions argued about preparation, taste, and portions. What one considered edible, another rejected. These small conflicts reflected larger differences, but were usually resolved quietly because hunger reduced pride. Medical staff observed the impact of poor diet on wounds and recovery. Healing slowed, infections spread more easily. Yet hospitals themselves struggled with supplies. Patients received slightly better food when possible, but even there, shortages were felt. Broth replaced solid meals. Weakness lingered. As months turned into years, soldiers' relationships with food changed. Some lost interest entirely, eating mechanically. Others became obsessed, counting bites, planning imaginary meals. Food became a mental escape. Conversations drifted toward restaurants, recipes, childhood kitchens. These memories softened the edges of war. The sound of eating became familiar, the scrape of metal on metal, the crack of hard bread breaking, the slurp of thin soup. These sounds filled quiet moments, grounding soldiers in routine. Silence during meals felt unnatural. Occasionally, special meals were organized to mark events, holidays, victories, visits from officers. These meals stood out sharply. Extra portions, fresh ingredients, even desserts appeared. Soldiers remembered these days vividly, not for what was eaten, but for how it felt to eat differently. Animals near the front learned quickly where food appeared. Rats, birds, and insects became constant companions at mealtimes. Soldiers guarded their rations fiercely. Sharing with animals was rarely voluntary. The presence of these creatures further blurred the boundary between human life and survival. As the war neared its end, food shortages worsened in many places. Morale dropped. Soldiers felt the strain physically and emotionally. The promise of peace became tied to the promise of eating properly again. Dreams of full meals, of sitting down, of eating without fear grew stronger. When the fighting stopped, many soldiers found civilian food overwhelming. Rich dishes caused discomfort. Large portions felt unnatural. Hunger had reshaped bodies and expectations. Some never fully returned to their old habits. Looking back, soldiers often remembered food not as flavor but as feeling. The ache of hunger, the relief of warmth, the comfort of routine, the disappointment of emptiness. Food was not just fuel. It was a companion through the war, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind. And so, when we think about what soldiers ate in the First World War,
we are not only thinking about ingredients or rations, we are thinking about patience, adaptation, and endurance, about men sitting quietly with their meals, surrounded by noise and danger, finding a few moments of stillness in the simple act of eating.
As the war continued, food stopped being discussed in terms of quality or preference and began to exist almost entirely as a physical sensation. It was no longer about taste. It was about weight in the stomach, warmth in the chest, and the brief illusion that the body could rest. Soldiers learned to listen to their hunger the way they listened to distant artillery, not with panic, but with resignation. Hunger became predictable. It arrived every day, at roughly the same hours, just as shells often did. In many units, men stopped asking what they were eating. The question felt unnecessary. Whatever arrived would be eaten. Curiosity faded quickly when answers never changed. Food lost its identity and became simply the ration. Soldiers spoke of it in abstract terms, as if naming it too precisely would give it power to disappoint them again. The containers mattered almost as much as the food itself. Metal tins, cloth sacks, wooden crates. Soldiers recognized the sound of rations arriving before they saw them. The dull clatter of tins, the scrape of boxes dragged through mud, the muffled curses of those carrying them forward. These sounds meant sustenance, but also reminded everyone how fragile the system was. If the sound did not come, neither did the meal.
Food was rarely eaten alone. Even when soldiers had enough space to sit apart, they gathered instinctively. Eating became communal not because of camaraderie, but because isolation made hunger heavier. Watching others eat reassured the mind that this suffering was shared. Silence during meals was common, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with chewing and the occasional sigh. The act of swallowing became automatic. Soldiers learned to override instinctive reactions to texture or smell. If something was edible, it was eaten. If it was questionable, it was eaten anyway, more quickly. Vomiting was avoided, not out of pride, but because food was too valuable to lose. Bodies adapted in ways civilians rarely understood. On days when nothing arrived, soldiers drank water instead. Water filled space, dulled pain. Some chewed on nothing, just to keep the mouth busy. Others smoked more, not for pleasure, but to trick the stomach. Hunger became a background ache, like a pulled muscle that never healed.
Food preparation behind the lines grew increasingly mechanical. Kitchens operated like factories, producing enormous quantities of identical meals. Cooks rarely tasted what they made. There was no time. The goal was consistency, not excellence. A meal that reached the front intact was a success, regardless of flavor. In some sectors, soldiers developed superstitions around food. A bad meal was seen as an omen. A delayed ration meant something would go wrong. A surprisingly good meal inspired cautious optimism. These beliefs were not logical, but logic had little place in a war where control was scarce. Weather influenced everything. Rain diluted soups, soaked bread, ruined storage. Heat spoiled meat before it could be distributed. Cold froze both food and hands, making eating physically painful. Soldiers burned more calories simply trying to stay warm, yet their portions rarely increased to match the demand. The body changed under these conditions. Weight loss was common, muscles weakened, faces hollowed. Hunger altered posture, movement, even speech. Men spoke more slowly, conserving energy. Jokes grew shorter. Laughter required effort.
Some soldiers became deeply attached to specific foods, even unpleasant ones. A familiar ration, no matter how bland, provided stability. Change, even improvement, could feel unsettling. When a different item appeared unexpectedly, it reminded soldiers that nothing was permanent, not even routine. Food distribution reflected hierarchy. Officers often ate better, though not always by design. Their distance from the front made transport easier. This difference was noticed, but rarely challenged openly. Resentment simmered quietly, expressed through sarcasm rather than confrontation. In moments of extreme scarcity, moral boundaries blurred. Soldiers stole food from abandoned villages, from supply depots, sometimes from each other. These acts were rarely discussed afterward. Hunger justified actions that peace would condemn. Survival reshaped ethics. Dreams about food were common. Soldiers dreamed of tables, kitchens, family meals. These dreams were vivid and painful.
Waking from them intensified hunger, creating a cruel contrast between imagination and reality. Yet soldiers rarely spoke of these dreams aloud.
The smell of civilian food drifting from distant towns could torture those at the front. A bakery operating miles away might as well have been on another planet. That smell reminded soldiers that normal life continued elsewhere, untouched by trenches and rations. As the war dragged into its later years, substitutes replaced original ingredients entirely. Foods were no longer imitations of pre-war meals, but new creations born of necessity. Soldiers adjusted expectations downward until disappointment became rare. Satisfaction was measured simply by fullness. Food affected morale more quietly than speeches or medals. A slightly larger portion, a warmer meal, a hint of seasoning could change the mood of an entire unit. Conversely, a missed delivery could sour days of effort. Commanders understood this, even when they could not fix it. In hospitals, wounded soldiers experienced food differently. Appetite often vanished. Pain replaced hunger. Nurses encouraged eating as part of healing, but bodies resisted. Recovery required nourishment, yet food felt foreign after long periods of deprivation.
As soldiers aged within the war, their relationship with food matured into something almost philosophical. Eating became a reminder of being alive. Each meal confirmed survival for another few hours. Food marked continuity in a world designed to interrupt it. When soldiers talked about the future, food dominated those conversations. Not victory, not medals, but meals. They spoke of bread that was soft, meat that was fresh, meals eaten slowly. The end of the war was imagined not as silence, but as eating without fear. Even after leaving the front, soldiers carried habits with them, eating quickly, hoarding scraps, feeling uneasy when food was plentiful. These behaviors lingered long after uniforms were discarded. Looking back, many veterans struggled to explain how deeply food shaped their war. It seemed too ordinary, too small compared to battles and loss. Yet in quiet moments, they remembered hunger more clearly than gunfire. Food was the war's quiet constant. It did not roar or explode. It waited. It arrived late. It disappointed. It sustained. It reminded soldiers that they were bodies first, soldiers second. As the First World War stretched forward without clear resolution, food became less a response to hunger and more a method of control over the body. Soldiers no longer trusted their appetite. Hunger appeared even when the body was weak, and sometimes disappeared when food was finally available. Eating turned into a learned behavior rather than a natural one, something done because it was time, not because desire existed. The war taught bodies to obey schedules rather than instincts. Over time, many soldiers lost the ability to recognize fullness. Meals ended not when satisfaction arrived, but when food ran out. Portions dictated limits. If there was more, it was eaten. If there was less, the body adjusted without protest. The stomach learned restraint not through discipline, but through necessity. Food also altered perception of time. A day without proper meals felt longer, heavier. Hours dragged when hunger lingered. Conversely, days with regular rations seemed to pass more smoothly, even if nothing else improved. The rhythm of eating replaced clocks. Soldiers waited for food the way civilians waited for news. In quiet sectors, where fighting slowed but never fully stopped, food became part of the soundscape. Pots clanged, ladles scraped, paper wrappings rustled. These noises stood out against distant gunfire, reminding soldiers that life continued in small, stubborn ways. Even the act of unwrapping a ration felt ceremonial, a pause carved out of chaos. Taste itself became unreliable. Foods that once would have been rejected were now accepted without comment. Conversely, occasionally receiving something genuinely flavorful could feel overwhelming. Strong tastes shocked the senses. Some soldiers found rich food uncomfortable, even unpleasant, after months of blandness. The mouth adapted to scarcity. The war also blurred distinctions between meals. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner lost meaning. Food arrived when it could, not when it should. Soldiers ate at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes not at all. The idea of a proper meal faded into memory. For those stationed in occupied territories, food carried political weight. Eating local food felt different from eating army rations. It reminded soldiers that civilians lived nearby, often hungry themselves. Sharing food with locals was rare but meaningful. Taking food from them felt heavier than taking from abandoned fields. In some cases, soldiers developed rituals around eating to impose order on disorder. A specific place, a certain way of sitting, a shared silence. These habits offered comfort. Even when food was poor, ritual made it predictable, and predictability was valuable. The body's response to prolonged inadequate nutrition was slow and subtle. Energy faded first, then resilience. Small tasks felt heavier. Recovery took longer. Soldiers did not always notice these changes happening. They only noticed when something that used to be easy became difficult. Cooking skills evolved under pressure. Men who had never prepared food before learned quickly. Improvisation became normal. Without recipes or guidance, soldiers relied on observation and instinct. Cooking was no longer about tradition, but function. Food also influenced discipline. Well-fed units tended to be calmer, more cooperative. Hunger sharpened tempers. Small disputes escalated more quickly when rations were low. Commanders often blamed morale issues on attitude, but soldiers knew hunger played a larger role. During long periods of inactivity, thoughts returned to food obsessively. Soldiers mentally constructed meals ingredient by ingredient. These imagined meals were detailed, slow, indulgent. They were eaten in the mind with more care than any real ration ever was. The presence of food could even change how soldiers perceived danger. A hot meal under fire felt defiant, almost rebellious. Eating while shells fell nearby created a strange sense of normality, as if danger could be temporarily ignored through routine. In moments of retreat or rapid movement, food was often abandoned. Heavy containers were left behind. Soldiers learned what was worth carrying and what was not. Food that could be eaten quickly and without preparation became essential. Everything else was expendable.
Some soldiers lost weight rapidly. Others, strangely, did not. Bodies reacted differently. Metabolism slowed. The body learned to conserve. Hunger did not always result in visible thinness. Fatigue became the more obvious symptom. Medical understanding of nutrition was limited, but observations accumulated. Doctors noticed patterns: slower healing, increased illness, reduced stamina. They understood the connection, but lacked solutions. The war consumed resources faster than science could respond. Food shortages at home affected soldiers indirectly. Letters described rationing, substitutes, scarcity. Knowing that families were also hungry created guilt. Some soldiers sent food home when they could, sacrificing their own needs. As supplies deteriorated, the idea of fairness became complicated. Who deserved more food? Those at the front or those wounded? Those marching or those guarding? Every distribution decision left someone dissatisfied. Hunger amplified perceived injustice. Occasionally, soldiers encountered abundance unexpectedly. A captured depot, a well-stocked farmhouse, a delayed shipment finally arriving. These moments felt unreal. Eating without restraint felt dangerous, as if the body no longer trusted abundance. When food spoiled, decisions had to be made quickly. Eat it and risk illness, or discard it and face hunger. Many chose to eat. Stomach pain was temporary. Hunger was constant. The social role of food extended beyond nourishment. It structured conversation. Complaints about rations were safe topics, less dangerous than criticizing orders or strategy. Food complaints allowed frustration to surface without punishment. In the final phases of the war, food symbolized collapse. When rations failed completely, it signaled more than hunger. It meant systems were breaking. Soldiers felt it before they heard it. After the war, many veterans struggled to articulate how deeply food had shaped their experience. It seemed trivial compared to loss and trauma, yet hunger lingered in memory, quiet but persistent. Food was never just food during the First World War. It was time, control, comfort, and fear. It was routine in a world without stability. It was the most ordinary thing in the most extraordinary circumstances.
In these conditions, food lost its emotional range. There was little excitement, little disappointment. Meals were received with neutrality. Even when something unexpectedly better appeared, reactions were muted. Soldiers had learned not to hope too much. Hope wasted energy. The surroundings influenced eating more than the food itself. Eating in darkness, eating under fire, eating while crouched in narrow spaces changed the entire experience. Meals were often interrupted. A bite taken, then a pause, then another. Food cooled between mouthfuls. Sometimes it was never finished, not because it wasn't wanted, but because circumstances changed without warning. The senses dulled. Smell faded first, then taste. Soldiers noticed that flavors blended together, that everything seemed vaguely similar. Texture mattered more than seasoning. Something solid felt more real than something liquid. Something warm felt more valuable than something filling. The physical effort required to eat sometimes outweighed the perceived benefit. Opening tins with cold hands, chewing hard food with sore jaws, swallowing dry bread without water. On especially difficult days, soldiers delayed eating, not out of discipline, but out of exhaustion. As the war extended beyond anything the soldiers had once imagined, food no longer stood at the center of daily thought. Instead, it hovered at the edge of awareness, present but diminished, something acknowledged only when it failed to appear. Hunger became less dramatic and more habitual, like the constant ache of tired muscles or the dull ringing left behind after artillery fire. It did not demand attention, it simply stayed. With time, many soldiers stopped associating food with pleasure altogether. The idea that a meal could be enjoyable began to feel unrealistic, almost childish. Eating was stripped down to its most basic purpose, preventing collapse. Soldiers ate to remain standing, to keep moving, to delay weakness for another day. Anything beyond that felt unnecessary. The body adapted quietly. Digestion slowed. Energy was rationed internally, just as supplies were rationed externally. Soldiers learned to perform tasks while undernourished, carrying weight, digging, marching, all while fueled by meals that barely cover basic needs. Fatigue became the default state. Rest, when it came, felt shallow and incomplete.
Food storage at the front was unreliable. Rodents found everything. Dampness ruined supplies. Soldiers developed habits to protect what little they had. Rations were hidden, wrapped, elevated, guarded. Losing food to animals felt like a personal failure, even when it was unavoidable. Meals also marked moments of vulnerability. Eating meant lowering awareness, setting down weapons, focusing inward. This made some soldiers uneasy. They ate quickly, scanning their surroundings, never fully relaxed. The act of eating became tense, compressed, incomplete. As the war aged, fewer soldiers remembered what proper meals felt like. New recruits arrived with civilian memories still fresh, but they adapted quickly. Within weeks, their expectations adjusted downward. The war reshaped standards efficiently. In some units, soldiers began skipping meals intentionally, saving rations for later. This behavior wasn't ordered, it emerged organically. Hunger felt manageable if it was controlled. Eating too early created anxiety about later emptiness. Saving food created the illusion of security. Food was sometimes used to reward or punish, formally or informally. Extra portions followed difficult tasks. Reduced rations followed discipline issues. These practices reinforced the idea that food was no longer neutral. It carried meaning beyond nutrition.
In moments of intense fear, appetite vanished completely. Before attacks, soldiers often could not eat even if food was available. Afterward, hunger returned suddenly and intensely, as if the body reclaimed what fear had suppressed. Eating after danger felt grounding, stabilizing. During prolonged shelling, food was often ignored. Soldiers clung to shelters, focusing on survival. Meals waited, forgotten, until silence returned. Food tasted different after fear, heavier, more urgent. The concept of waste changed entirely.
Scraps that would have been discarded in civilian life were now consumed without hesitation. Fat was valued. Bones were boiled repeatedly. Nothing edible was thrown away willingly. Even so, food poisoning occurred. Soldiers learned to recognize the difference between hunger pain and sickness. Sometimes the line blurred. Illness was endured quietly, without complaint, because complaining changed nothing. As the front shifted, soldiers encountered abandoned kitchens, broken pantries, half-eaten meals left behind by civilians fleeing combat. These sights were unsettling. Food prepared but not eaten symbolized interruption. Lives paused mid-gesture. Food shortages also affected discipline indirectly. Tired, hungry soldiers made mistakes. Orders were misunderstood. Reaction time slowed. Officers noticed these effects, but often attributed them to morale rather than nutrition. In rare moments of extended rest, soldiers sometimes attempted to recreate civilian meals using imagination more than ingredients. A piece of bread became a base for something imagined rather than real. The act of pretending restored dignity. The longer the war lasted, the less soldiers spoke about food out loud. Complaints diminished not because conditions improved, but because repetition drained meaning. Silence replaced protest. Food appeared in songs, jokes, and dark humor. But even there, it lost sharpness. Early war jokes about bad rations were replaced by resigned remarks, half smiles, shared glances. Humor softened into acceptance. As supplies thinned, food diversity vanished. Diets narrowed. The body learned monotony. Variety became irrelevant. Eating became routine maintenance.
At times, soldiers felt detached from their own bodies. Hunger existed, but it felt distant, abstract. Pain elsewhere overshadowed it. The body became a tool, and food became maintenance rather than care. Night intensified hunger. Darkness stripped away distractions. Stomachs growled more loudly. Thoughts returned to food more insistently. Soldiers lay awake, imagining fullness, warmth, slow meals eaten without urgency. When letters arrived describing feasts, celebrations, or seasonal dishes, reactions were mixed. Some found comfort. Others felt alienated. Civilian food felt like it belonged to another world. The war altered soldiers' understanding of necessity. They learned how little was truly required to continue functioning. This knowledge lingered after the war, reshaping lives in peace. Food scarcity taught patience, endurance, and resignation, but also resilience. Soldiers learned that the body could survive more than expected, adapt more than imagined. In the end, food was not remembered for flavor or abundance, but for consistency. It was always there or not there, shaping days quietly. It did not define heroism or victory, but it defined survival.
As the war entered its longest phase, food ceased to interrupt the day. It no longer marked beginnings or endings. Instead, it slid quietly into the background, becoming part of the environment rather than an event. Soldiers no longer paused for meals. They absorbed them between moments. Eating happened in fragments, between orders, between movements, between noises. Food no longer demanded attention. It accepted neglect. The body adjusted to this neglect in subtle ways. Hunger did not announce itself sharply. It arrived gradually, like fading light. Soldiers felt it less in the stomach and more in the limbs, in the slow heaviness that settled into muscles, in the delay between intention and movement. Hunger was no longer a signal to eat. It was simply a condition of being present. Meals lost their boundaries. A soldier might eat part of a ration, then hours later finish the rest without remembering when the meal had begun. Food became continuous, unstructured, scattered across time. This blurred the sense of day and night even further. Eating no longer aligned with rest. It aligned with opportunity.
The environment dictated everything. Wind cooled food before it could be swallowed. Rain diluted it. Darkness hid it. Noise interrupted it. Soldiers learned to accept these intrusions as normal. Complaining felt pointless.
The war did not adjust for meals. As months passed, many soldiers stopped describing food in concrete terms. They spoke instead of something warm or something solid. Specifics faded. Language simplified. Precision was unnecessary when choices were limited. The physical memory of food from civilian life grew faint. Soldiers struggled to recall textures accurately. Bread remembered as softer than it had been. Meat imagined as richer. Memory smoothed imperfections, exaggerating comfort. Food became nostalgic, even when remembered incorrectly. The act of chewing slowed. Jaw muscles tired easily. Hard food required effort. Some soldiers swallowed quickly to avoid fatigue. Eating became another task that drained energy rather than restored it. Calories entered the body, but relief lagged behind.
Food no longer satisfied immediately. Even after eating, hunger often remained. The body learned that meals were insufficient and stopped expecting fullness. Satisfaction was replaced by tolerance. The goal was not to feel fed, but to feel less empty. Smell, once a powerful trigger, lost influence. Constant exposure to trench odors overwhelmed subtler scents. Food smelled like surroundings rather than ingredients. Everything carried the same undertone of earth and metal. Soldiers began to associate certain sensations with eating, regardless of food. Cold fingers, damp clothing, awkward posture. These sensations became inseparable from meals. Even years later, some veterans reported feeling uneasy eating in comfort, as if something essential was missing. Food distribution became increasingly impersonal. Rations were passed along without comment. There was little conversation. Eating did not invite discussion. It was completed quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. Occasionally, a soldier would pause mid-bite, struck by a sudden awareness of the act itself. Eating while surrounded by destruction felt strange, almost inappropriate. These moments passed quickly. Reflection required energy, and energy was scarce. The war taught bodies to operate below capacity. Soldiers functioned in a state of controlled deficiency. This became normal. The idea of abundance felt abstract, distant, theoretical.
Food scarcity altered perception of value. Time spent eating felt less valuable than time spent resting. Soldiers sometimes skipped meals, not out of strategy, but because lying still felt more important. The mouth became a mechanical entry point rather than a sensory space. Taste buds dulled. Texture mattered only insofar as it allowed swallowing. Pleasure disappeared quietly, without protest. Even water changed meaning. Drinking became as important as eating, sometimes more so. Hydration replaced nourishment as the immediate need. Food could wait. Thirst could not. During long periods of silence, soldiers became acutely aware of their bodies. Hunger surfaced more clearly then. Inaction allowed sensation to rise. Movement suppressed it. Thus, some soldiers preferred constant minor activity to avoid feeling empty. Food preparation skills stagnated. Improvisation declined as resources dwindled. Creativity required surplus, and surplus vanished. Cooking reverted to repetition. The war also changed how soldiers perceived waste. Dropping food caused distress out of proportion to the loss. A single lost portion felt symbolic, as if the war itself had taken notice. In rare moments when soldiers encountered civilian kitchens intact, the sight felt unreal. Pots, shelves, prepared ingredients suggested a world that functioned differently. Eating in such spaces felt invasive even when permitted. Food became linked to guilt. Eating while civilians nearby starved felt uncomfortable. Soldiers rarely spoke of this discomfort, but it lingered. As years passed, many soldiers stopped keeping track of what they ate. Days blurred, memory failed. Only extreme moments stood out. Days without food, days with something unexpectedly warm. The body's signals grew quieter. Hunger no longer demanded immediate response. It simply coexisted. Soldiers learned to ignore it as they ignored distant noise. When peace eventually approached, food began to re-enter consciousness slowly. Anticipation returned cautiously. The body remembered desire before the mind allowed hope. Even then, eating remained restrained. Soldiers did not immediately trust abundance. They approached food carefully, suspiciously.
as if it might disappear again. The war left behind bodies trained in scarcity. Eating would never be entirely effortless again.